the cooling of the conservatories was a huge challenge. I mean, if you look at most conservatory types around the world, they're normally made to keep you need to let the light in to keep the plants growing. But in the northern hemisphere or in the temperate climates, you would be looking to the glasshouse to keep heat in rather than trying to keep heat out. So what we needed for the plants to grow was a lot of light, 45,000 lux for more than 500 hours a year. And what we needed then to do was to try and keep the sun out, the tropical sun out, on the hottest days, because we simply couldn't deal with the solar gain that came with it. Because Singapore is very cloudy for a lot of the time, we needed to have a way of modulating the light coming into the glass house, and therefore we ended up with the shading on the outside of the building. So we then introduced air at the floor level to only cool the area where the plant roots, and the people are. So we've got a displacement system bringing air in, and the air that comes into the space is conditioned by drying it using a cycle called liquid desiccant dehumidification. I may have lost you already, but you know when you buy a shoes or a handbag or something like that, you get inside the box you get a little bag of material called it's called a desiccant. So it pulls the moisture out of the air. If you warm that back up again, it'll drive the moisture off. And so the way the cooling in the conservatory works is to pass the air through a liquid stream of desiccant, and that removes a lot of the humidity from the air, which allows us to cool it down in quite a gentle way, so that we can to about 19 degrees without having to strip all the moisture out using refrigeration. This takes a bit of time to explain, Jeremy, so I'll stick with it. And so we've then got a lot of water sitting on the floor of this machine that we've dragged out of the air, and we have to try and boil that off. So there was a key moment in the project when we were having a dinner with the client, and he was saying that the one thing he has in Singapore is a lot of trees, and he has to look after all the trees, 3 million of them, that he basically prunes once every 2 years. And that generates enormous amounts of wood waste. So that wood waste used to go to landfill or used to be incinerated, and we said this could be our energy source that we need for the whole of the garden. So what we do is we bring in about 8 truckloads of wood waste, which is tree waste, tree prunings, that have been chipped and then mixed with packing case waste from the container port. We burn it in a huge boiler, and there's a chimney that goes up one of the super trees. So there's a chimney here that dissipates the heat. So we've got a big boiler that generates steam. The steam goes into a turbine. The turbine generates power. The waste heat from the turbine goes into an absorption chiller to produce chilled water, which chills the conservatories. The second stage waste heat then goes to the desiccant drying units, which dry all the dessiccants out, and then the heat goes back to a little cooling tower which sits above the energy centre. So basically the entire cooling system is run on wood waste from the port and from the tree pruning program in Singapore. Ta-da.
Well done. I mean, get that one out of the way, because the great thing about this is that what it allows is the most spectacular series of displays that Paul has said. There's this notion of perpetual spring. The cooling has to take place to trick the plants into thinking it's spring all the time, particularly, I guess, those in the temperate house where you do have plants that expect spring. And so what this results, and I think why this is particularly relevant now, is that you won the display category. So it's actually one of the aspects of this as a design is about display. And Andrew, you had an idea about a theatre of plants. Could you say a bit and a bit about how you're displaying plants? These are not shown as you would find them if you went for a wander through the rainforest with the king cobras and kite snakes and all those things, just waiting to bite you. You're seeing them in a very thought out and presented way, like a theatre.
Yes, I mean the two conservatories. One is the flower dome, which has got Mediterranean plants in it, and essentially cultivated environment. The idea of people's use of plants, and we thought that'd be nice to sort of show it in a sort of more theatrical way. It's a spatial choreographed experience as you go through. You learn about the different sort of regions. Quite different to the cloud forest, which is about being immersed in a sort of a three-dimensional version of a tropical rainforest. So yeah, just coming back to the point you were asking about supernature, right? It's all about how do we engage people with the plants? How do we show people plants in the 21st century that's going to engage them, going to get people interested in what's going on with the environmental systems, as well as here's a fantastic display. So we needed to sort of crank up the experience, really.
Yeah. So it's like the way a theatrical performance might extract and condense and represent aspects of human interaction and human experience. Here you're trying to do that between plants themselves, but particularly between plants and people.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, it's a really interesting thing. Here we are in a very sort of cosmopolitan, sort of advanced sort of city, where you've got nature on rainforest on your doorstep. So how do you sort of get people excited about coming to a park and seeing plants and flowers and learn about those sort of things?
It's worth seeing the video of the competition submission, which shows the original idea about the thing as the plants. It's about 1 minute.
Okay,
video.
should we have a quick look at that?
I think it's an interesting point that you make about theatre, or nature as theatre, and it's a sort of about turn on the origin of pleasure gardens, actually. The 18th century pleasure gardens in London were made for people to mix. Unusual people were able to mix, but the theatres actually had to be built in them to get people to go to them. So it's a big change. So here,
Andy, do you want to talk? The video's running.
nature is theatre. Quite a different concept.
So yeah, this is Squid Opera made this movie at the competition stage, which is a defining sort of little piece of the jigsaw in terms of communicating what we're trying to do. At one level, we wanted it to be very clearly about very intelligent environmental management, environmental planning, environmental design. At the other level, pure wonder. How do we generate a sense of wonder and beauty with the elements that we could use in this project?
You can see the idea of display in the video in a big way.
As always, I mean, a lot of this process, I mean, things evolve. Which plants actually we're going to go into each one, but right from the start, you can see the different characteristics of each conservatory. This is the origins of the cloud forest. We knew we wanted to put a mountain of some sort right at the heart of this and immerse people in a magical journey through the experience.
I think it's true to say that this was done at competition stage, and we made the computer model that was based on. So we suddenly had these extraordinary forms we were exploring. And then Andrew rang up and said, "We've won." And then we thought, we've got to deliver what we had fantasized about. And it was, I mean, an amazing opportunity, as Neil says, with an incredibly creative and brave client. But that whole process of transforming some of the thoughts that were represented in there, and it is the power of the movie that actually took on a life of its own. So it took a really long time to explain that the mountain wasn't just a big pile of earth, but that we were planning to put it as a building. We were planning to do displays and exhibitions inside it, that we wanted to do a climate change story inside. So we had to work quite hard, taking some of the very brilliant things that were in there and making them feasible. So in the Mediterranean world, the whole idea of the wrap of plants actually became a series of terraces with a flower field in the center. And I always loved the idea of the mountain in one side and a kind of valley in the other, the two working together.
I was doing so well.
I think it's amazing. We've kind of only talked about the conservatories, but the most fantastic thing about this, again, the kind of collaboration, is the way everything kind of works together. And the big display is fantastic. I arrived last night to find out it won an award. It's great to work on the project and great to be a part of it. But the idea of the super trees further into the landscape, these things, it's where Andrew kind of pulls landscape into real, full, proper architecture. It's not a landscape, you know, like this around the kind of ground. It lifts into the air through these structures. And I think those structures, they contain environmental mechanisms, they collect water, they collect sun, they provide shade, and then they're plants as well. They're kind of infrastructure to support plants. And as display goes, they are, you know, unsurpassed, I think, in the world.
One has a bar in one as well.
We're going to talk about the super trees a bit in a moment if we can, but I just want to draw Jim out a bit more about the notion of the conservatory, because you, Wilkinson Eyre, had designed at least one significant conservatory at Kew, and this was very much about rethinking the idea of a conservatory.
Yes, I think Patrick, in fact it was Patrick and ourselves that designed this particular little conservatory at Kew, which was an alpine house, which is going to appear any second now.
I've lost my mouse, Jim.
But I think it was probably about 10 years ago that we were appointed by Kew Gardens to do a master plan. They wanted to apply for World Heritage Site status, which they actually got. And Kew is full of historic buildings. And there were a number of projects that we identified, but the first one that we actually got to do ourselves was this tiny little alpine house, which, rather like Gardens by the Bay, is a cooled conservatory. It wasn't the first cooled conservatory in the world. I think that's in Missouri, isn't it, Patrick?
Yes.
And it's minute. It's 9 meters across, 18 meters long, and 9 meters high. And it uses virtually no energy to cool the plants. So it's rather like a sort of glass umbrella. And the whole design of it, I might actually let Patrick mention two things, but he's got to promise to be very short about it. One is the labyrinth. And are you going to mention your termite mounds?
No, probably not.
All right.
It was, but no. The cooling. The idea of this building is that the plants sit in a cool well at the bottom. Again, when this thing underneath is just a simple blockwork structure we call a labyrinth, which air is passed through at night to cool the concrete down. It's a concrete structure, and then in the daytime we pass the hot air through it, which then chills it down. It's a device we'd used elsewhere, but it's on a couple of other projects. But principally, then the cool air comes out of a labyrinth and just passes over the mountain plants and keeps them cool, while the heat is taken away by a natural vent system that runs up the back of the glass house.
But I think the other thing that we had to learn on this and work out how to do technically was to get the amount of light over the year that was needed to sustain alpine plants. I mean, they come at the top of mountains, they get used to having huge amounts of light, and actually they also have to be kept dry. So that was carried on into this project. So the fundamental form of those buildings comes from trying to get the right amount of light. And the client, Paul, gave us a brief of how many lux hours.
Well, the more amusing bit, I think, was after we won the competition, the client came to Kew along with a team of ministers and dignitaries, and they went to Alpine House, and they all looked at each other and said, it's very small, isn't it? Because it's like that, and the ones we're doing my arms aren't wide enough. I mean, so there was but it was lots of lessons. There were lessons of us working together. There was lessons of the whole idea of how do you cool the conservatory, the idea of heat versus light, how do you balance those two out, and just the whole process of trying to do it as sustainably as possible. And Patrick's talked about the trees. We didn't come to that first off. We were going to do everything to do with water and wind and sun and everything else. But clearly, the Singapore climate is so tough that the one thing that actually does flourish here, and it's almost its own natural resource, is plant growth. So I also love the idea that the trees are allowing these foreign inhabitants to survive. So it is trees fueling the trees, making the place work. And that's a nice kind of balance. It's a nice synchronicity.
I think, Jeremy, while we've got this slide up, it might just be worth talking about the point about getting light into the building and the reasons why the building's shaped how it is, why it has a grid shell, and the shaping of that grid shell. And this is a set of drawings we did quite early on to establish the smallest amount of shadow that we could get off the structure. So as you progress from left to right, what is built is really the one on the right, where you have that little sort of triangular shaped grid shell structure, and that casts the narrowest possible shadow. The other fundamental point about the form of the building, or the way we design it and its Neil's structure, is that the big steel ribs are on the outside. Because the building's such a big space, if the structure had been on the inside, you would have walked in and all you would have seen is structure. And we were determined that you should see sky, or you should perceive sky at the very least. And I think that's something that has been very effective. That little drawing on the right shows the profile of the rib. It's a little bit hard to see. And in the base of that rib, the shading devices are concealed in the base of that rib.
Neil, there are basically two structural systems, as I think I understand it. The grid shell and the big rib arches. Perhaps you could say a bit about how they interact and
Yeah,
why they work together as a structural system.
Shells are, I mean, everybody understands an eggshell. You take an egg, it's very, very fragile, but as an object, very strong. So these shells, you sit down under their own weight, they carry the glass and the steelwork themselves. They're fantastic like that. The minute you blow wind sideways onto them, they buckle. It's just the simple nature of them. They're very, 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 very thin. So the ribs on the outside carry one condition of load, which is the sideways load. They're separated from the shell itself because to allow as much light in as possible. And so the shell forms the kind of enclosure and the ribs form the structure to stop the wind sideways.
A scheme, the project was actually was ribs, because we thought that the ribs would give us the shading that we needed, and it was only when we modelled it in detail we found that it was the ribs were casting too much shadow and making it too dark inside. So we had to lighten the structure right up. We went through trusses, all different solutions, until we arrived at this one, which gave us the light levels we needed inside the glass house, balanced with the solar gain. So it was very much an iterative process that was tested by quite a serious amount of computer modelling of light levels and lighting intensity.
I just want to say we made the grid more complicated, the grid shell, by doing incline on the Mediterranean biome, which meant that no sun actually hit that face, or very limited early morning sun. But that, of course, made the whole thing more tricky for the engineer, just for fun.
And then, of course, there are the shades that deploy when the sun is full out, that would filter out the excess heat, and indeed, presumably, the excess light as well. But they're primarily to do with heat, aren't they? The shades?
They're really
yes.
completely to do with heat. There's two things about them. Firstly is they reduce the amount of sun coming into, which helps the generally the cooling loads, fairly obviously. But actually the other thing they do is they provide, because radiation is such a big deal when you're standing under glass, it's comfort for the occupants as well. So on very sunny days, middle of the day, if you were standing under the glass, it would be very uncomfortable walking around inside the glass house. So the deployed shades give you patches of coolness to stand in, away from the bright sun. And the intention is the shades don't necessarily deploy fully on a if it's partial sunshine, the shades may only come out at 50%, just to knock back the cooling load, and then they'll retract again. And then if it gets noonday sun, we will put the shades right out. So we're still testing and working up in operation. The team at Gardens by the Bay are basically running different scenarios and checking out how the trees like or don't like the light levels at with different settings.
Let's talk a bit about the super trees as well, because they're also quite spectacular and extraordinary. And again, there's combination of environmental, structural, and, as it were, display purposes.
All those
You're
things,
wrong.
Jeremy. Absolutely all those things. Sorry. I think why did we put super trees? What are the super trees there for? And they're to do a few things. Strategically, we wanted to put something in the garden that had some scale that works with the city and actually counterbalance the conservatories. Because if there wasn't anything like that, the conservatories would be the principal objects, and we'd have some nice gardens and things. But that was but this is a project about gardens. So to have something that works with the scale of the city and the emerging scale of the city in that part of the place, and as I was saying, we wanted to generate this sort of sense of wonder and get people to come to the place and think, wow, this is amazing. At the same time, inform that with all these environmental systems, the photovoltaics, water harvesting, shading, creating biodiversity habitats on the structures, and allow people to experience the space in quite a different way by putting the aerial walkway up and allowing people to get up to the top of the trees. So it's a very multifaceted idea.
Neil, would you like to say a bit about how they stand up and why they stand up?
I'd first like to say I read in the paper just before I left that the walkway between the trees is wobbly. And I'd like you to know that it was designed to be wobbly. It's not a mistake. It's not an error on our part. It was the idea of having a walkway that would be slightly uncomfortable. So if you have tried it, then now you know that it should do that. And if you haven't, go and have a go. I'm not going to go on it. I'm not a fan of heights. So. But the super trees, the structures, developed out of long conversations. That's what's amazing about the things. I think the idea of not replicating nature, not trees. They're a kind of It's the idea of a tree, but taking it, understanding that these things are the materials we're using are not, it's not growing things. They're structures, they're steel structures. They create an infrastructure onto which then all the other things can be done, the planting and everything. So it was the idea of how trying to represent plants, trees with a steel structure. So in fact, they're very, very simple forms. They're conical forms. It's the same stuff Gaudi did. Sagrada Familia. You form a structure in tension and then reverse it and turn it into a compression surface. So the canopies are three-dimensional surfaces and they're stiff in themselves. So they're very, very light and very, very thin, which still provides, the kind of mesh of them provides a level of shade, but light enough that the structures could be built and supported off this base core, just a very simple cantilever from the ground. So they are actually relatively straightforward structures, although perhaps they look a little more sophisticated.
They're hollow concrete shells, and up in the centre of them, in many of them. So one of the things you notice, or you don't notice as you go around the gardens, is how does all the air get in and out? How do we dump heat? How do we where do the boiler flues go? And what the super trees do conceal is all the infrastructure, the sort of technical infrastructure to make the glass houses work. So the one on the left here, for example, the taller one on the left is carrying the discharge from the desiccant drying system. It's hidden away in the centre of that. As you come in the entrance grove, there's one of the big super trees there, the 37-metre tree, has the boiler flue as one single element. So that it's also one of the things that we learned from Eden, which was a precursor to this project in some ways in Cornwall in England, was trying to sort of be more discreet about the infrastructure. So it's pretty invisible as you walk around. You really don't see a lot of what makes it tick. But there is actually, underneath the skin of the building, there's a huge infrastructure of distribution of pipes and wires and services that run around to deliver the energy systems for the building.
I think there's another interesting point about the trees is that these are architectural trees, and what you'll see in architecture is a lot of tree structures, and usually those tree structures are holding up roofs in buildings. They're not really trees at all, and they're done to reduce spans. But I think this is an interesting take to have an architectural tree that is like a tree.
Enjoy, yes.
One thing I forgot to say about the trees as well was they allow us to transform the garden at night. They give us the opportunity to create a three-dimensional experience that at night time and make it a destination for people to go, which we couldn't do with just ordinary sort of natural trees or the normal things you'd expect in a garden.
It's a very good point. I think the nighttime experience is one of the super key considerations. Clearly, it's tough walking around a garden in the day in Singapore, so right from the very early stages, our whole ambition was to make it a fantastic nighttime destination.
And of course, this is a new part of Singapore's territory. I don't know, 20 years ago, is that right? It was still sea. Okay, so 40 years ago it was still sea. And of course, once it's reclaimed, it takes some time to settle before you can build anything on it. So this is actually the first generation of use of that land. When it's come to renew the conservatories in about 250 years or something, there may be a lot of Singapore to the south of it. We don't know yet because that will unfold. But I mean, as part of a sort of idea of the tropical garden city that Dr. Tan, the client, and I believe the Minister Mentor have conceived, this is a piece of Singapore that they've created from scratch, or has been created from scratch. This is perhaps the ideal of what a tropical garden city is.
I think it's also interesting because clearly Singapore and most of the buildings in Singapore are very significantly conditioned. So I think it's a nice and logical extension of that to try and do a controlled climate in the most sustainable way as possible. So what we hope is that some of the subjects and some of the ways that things are dealt here, again, not overcooling, but doing it appropriately, and thinking about a whole possibility of larger climate-controlled zones that are done as sustainably as possible. Hopefully, this is a bit of an experimental idea that might grow to do other things, to make less pleasant places much more pleasant to live.
And you were saying it's in a way it's symbolic of Singapore as a city in a garden, which is the new idea, and I think that's right. I mean, it's really an amazing piece of strategic planning to create 100 hectares when the whole thing is done in the middle of the most valuable real estate. Because I think the people planning and thinking about the future of Singapore recognize it's going to be very high density living, but you need to have those outdoor spaces for people to escape and to enjoy the outside and to learn about the natural environment. And I think what we've tried to do, I keep sort of coming back to these points, is it's not just a nice place to go, but it's actually a nice place to go and learn about things. There's lots of educational infrastructure built into this. It's informed by some very intelligent environmental design and planning, lots of integrated systems, the water systems, the energy systems, the creation of habitats. So, it's a park that's got to do many, many things, and that's the sort of pattern I think that Singapore is presenting to the world. Let's really get things working hard.
And another interesting parallel, it strikes me, with the presentation we've just seen about a strategy for preserving a part of Sumatra's rainforest. There, a lot of the issues around preservation involve governance and macroeconomics. Here, in this particular location, a lot of the governance and macroeconomics are already quite well resolved. So in a sense, all those pipes that Patrick was showing just now, the environmental design, is actually what, to this project, what governance and macroeconomics are to preserving the Sumatran rainforest.
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
I think that was a statement, not a question, wasn't it?
I think it probably was a statement. I know that Marco Goldschmidt is very keen to come in with a question, but Marco, could you come round to the front? 'Cause I don't think the microphone will reach there. And while Marco, former president of the Royal Institute of British Architects, is making his way to ask a question. I think there are a couple of other points which are fundamentally interesting. One of which is, you're here. Well, you ask a question and I'll come in.
Okay, well, the technical side is extraordinary and brilliant, and at least two of you have told me you never believed the project would happen. It was too good to be true. Yeah. And it has happened. And I'm just thinking whether you'd like to say anything about comparing this and the client of this with some of the crazy clients of the past, like whoever commissioned the Parthenon and whoever commissioned the Pompidou Center, well, we know who that was. Yeah. Places that become places, must-see places, must-go-to places, and the importance of the visionary client in following through a project and not destroying it halfway through because they lose their cojones.
Sure.
I think, well, I'll sort of kick in. I mean, it's the point that Neil made right at the beginning is that we had a fantastic client who had a very clear idea about what they wanted to achieve here, and allowed us the space to develop that as a sort of design team, informing us, steering us as we go. But yeah, I mean, where did the vision come from? I mean, at one level, it's the sort of the minister mentor in the sort of very highest level, setting the agenda for Singapore as a city, a garden city. And that trickles down through the whole political framework, and the URA, the sort of the National Parks Board. But the Dr. Tan, Dr. Kiat Tan, basically the individual that we're talking about as particularly as the guy who single-handedly steered it through.
Yeah, it's perfect and extraordinary to have one person whose vision works all the way through. So instead of, we presented to many groups and many committees, but clearly Dr. Tan was the one who steered it, and the opportunities that creates to actually build a proper rapport with one person who is driving is the thing that makes it special.
And I think the point you made, Marco, about sticking to their guns was what was amazing, because you can see from the video that the finished product is very close to the kind of the competition vision that was set out. And there were moments when it could have derailed, it could have simplified, it could have changed, it could have become less magical than it was. And when those moments came along, they toughed it out. They went, we looked. Occasionally we lost the odd super tree. I think along the way there was some collateral damage in the tree department.
But we weren't going to let them lose a conservatory.
No. There was a moment when
there was quite a moment when that nearly happened.
One conservatory was on the line, but that was part of the political thing that was going on. That do you want to lose a whole? That's like cutting an arm off, isn't it? Doing something would have been to do something like that.
But I think in terms of your question about precedents, I suppose, and in reference to the conservatories, the obvious one is Crystal Palace and Paxton, driving that through. Incredible building, the biggest building in the world at the time, and also the fastest, biggest building ever built, and then rebuilt, and then sadly, of course, burnt down in South London in 1936, I think it was.
Well, one of the, I think, absolutely fascinating points about this is its combination of very, very highly technical thinking and also how the plants interact. And I remember asking some time ago whether this proximity of plants, perhaps not in a familiar place to each other as they would occur in nature, whether there are going to be new sorts of plants emerging from this, as we might see a new sort of architecture.
Who knows?
Hopefully no mutations.
Well, maybe.
But it's a very good point. I mean, I think what's interesting is, what is a Singapore landscape? What's it made of? And a lot of the trees and the plants you see in the streets and the parks are actually from South America. They're the generic sort of tropical plants. So at one level, this garden perpetuates that because it's actually introducing a whole new set of species. But at the same time, what we try to do is actually try to generate parts of it which are actually driven by what is more native species, so natural rainforest type species, so that we start to remember the true qualities of the environment here, the original biodiversity.
I think it's just one other point just to make, Jeremy, which is about something that's happened through the course of the project. I mean, I'm sure the room is full of people, of designers, and often when you're designing projects, you have a meeting with your design team, and you go off, and your meeting finishes. You might go to the pub for a drink or to a bar, but usually that's the end of it, and you disappear off. What happened with this project, because we were all coming in for a week at a time, about every month for a long period, was we became completely immersed in the project, and you became steeped in it. So every evening, even after the meetings and presentations were finished, the conversations carried on, and the kind of the merging of structure, architecture, landscape, and engineering happened around several beers, around nice dinners in Singapore restaurants, but it happened through just a complete immersion in the project. And I think it's something that we don't do often enough as designers, is that we all really, really get in each other's pockets for a long period of time. And that, on a project this scale and this far from our home, that was something we could feasibly do, and it was affordable because of the way the project was set up and doable. And I think that led to personally very strong bonds within the team. We're all still very good friends, which is good to know after this sort of 5-year journey. But it's all about the kind of the fusion of integrated design, and I think that's what's been so extraordinary about this project, is that it does really feel like, as you walk around it, I hope as you do walk around it, you see how tightly knit all the ideas are, and how the architecture and the engineering all fuse together to make something that really is very special.
Which again could be a metaphor for Singapore, because going back to Singapore's origins, as a trading settlement in the 1820s, it was all about plants. It was plants that made it a trading settlement, and then each community that came in to service the trading activities brought their own style of plants. And this is something you've tried to represent in another part of the garden.
That's right. I mean, the sort of cultural significance of plants is set out in the heritage gardens. There's a garden for the Indian culture, Chinese, Malay, and the Western. The Western one is very much, it tells the story of trade, plant trade, and Singapore's relationship with plants has grown out of that sort of dynamic, and it's very, very interesting how the evolution of that.
Yeah. Good. Well, I think we could go on talking about this project for several days probably. I hope we've all had an opportunity to enjoy it. We did have an evening party there two nights ago, I think, wasn't it? And I hope there's still some chance to go. Patrick is very keen to point out a rather magnificent book, which
it describes all the technical part of the project we've just been talking about. So it's Oro just released it this week. It's for sale at the bookshop at the back on the Oro stand. And a few of us are going to wander over there in a minute and do some signing if anyone's interested in a signed copy. So that's a book of the technical story of Gardens by the Bay. Yeah. Sorry about that, but I had to do it.
But of course, the experience of it is something that's open to you. I'm not sure what its opening times are, but it's certainly open.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
Anytime.
At any time.
Yeah.
So if you haven't had the opportunity to go and see it, do, because what we wanted to do with this discussion and indeed with the film was not to substitute for the experience of seeing it and visiting it, but to give you a bit of information that might help you get a bit more out of it. I hope that's what it's done. I certainly feel it's helped me with that. And I'd like to thank our 5 speakers, Jim, Neil, Paul, Andrew and Patrick, for participating. Thank you.